Hey everybody, this is a piece by Bruno Bongiovanni. It's titled The Dissolution of Trotskyism. What year is this thing from? It was originally published in an Italian journal in 1979. That journal is titled Anarchos. Read Bruno Bongiovanni's Wikipedia page real quick. In Italian. Alright, so Bruno Bongiovanni is born in 1947 and is an Italian historian, married since 1968 to the French literature scholar Mariolina Bongiovanni Bertini, a full professor until 2017. Bruno Bongiovanni graduated in contemporary history in 1972 from the Faculty of Letters and Philosophy of the University of Turin. The subject of his thesis was the social nature of the USSR, considered anti-socialist, a thesis that became a book in 1975. Previously, he had done research publishing a book at the Giovanni Angeli Foundation in Turin. In 1972-73, he worked at the CNR. He then began his university career at the University of Turin. From 1974 to 1981, he was a scholarship holder and a contract worker, and then, starting in 1981, he was, always for contemporary history, a researcher, associate professor, and soon full professor. Bruno Bongiovanni has continuously joined the degree courses in history and historical sciences, also joining the Department of Cultures, Politics, and Society in the last 5 years of university activity. Precisely until 2017, when the teaching institutions were modified. From the beginning of 1991 to 2004, Bongiovanni held annually at the Turin headquarters of the Bureau International du Travail courses in the history of international politics organized by Ministry of Foreign Affairs for aspiring diplomatic careers. Focusing mainly on the history of the French Revolution, socialism, international relations, U.S.-USSR relations, the Cold War, totalitarianism, and the three Italies, the liberal, the fascist, and the republican, Bruno Bongiovanni's research was carried out not only in Turin, Milan, Rome, and Florence, but also largely in Paris, in Berlin, Amsterdam, London, Zurich, and Vienna. It has been translated into 6 languages. Bruno Bongiovanni has been a corresponding member since 2016 and a national resident member since 2004 of the Academy of Sciences of Turin for History, Archaeology, and Geography, class of Moral, Historical, and Philological Sciences, and is present in the Scientific Committee of the Gaetano Salvemini Institute of Historical Studies of Turin, the Luigi Firpo Foundation of Turin, of the Amadeo Bordiga Foundation of Formia, and of the Luigi Micheletti Foundation of Brescia, and the Federico Chabad Foundation of Aosta. Bruno Bongiovanni collaborates and has collaborated with various publishing houses, with daily newspapers, especially La Unità, as well as with weeklies including Rinascita and Diario, and with monthlies. He has dealt with books and publishing in Rai radio broadcasts. Bongiovanni was awarded the Pisa National Literary Award, Pisa National Literary Prize for essays. He has also directed and directs 3 series at the publishers La Terza, Unicopli, and Stylos. As regards magazines, Bongiovanni has published articles, interventions, columns, and reviews in various publications, including Passato e Passante, of which he was part of the direction, and Studi Storici, Rivista di Storia Contemporanea, la Indici dei Libri del Mese, Belfagor, Il Ponte, Monthly Review, Telos, Quaderni Storici, Quaderni di Storia, Linea de Ombra, Mondo Operaio, Tutto Libri, Il Tetto, Necromafi, and others. He has written essays and works with several volumes and in encyclopedic dictionaries, and he then published and introduced, always in volumes, texts sometimes unpublished in Italy by Ottorino Perrone, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Daniel Guerin, Maximilien Rubel, Baruch Spinoza, John Tosh, Bruno Rizzi, Isaiah Berlin, Robert Palmer, Joel Colton, Giovanni Borgognone, Max Hultz, Luca La Rovere, Elana Fallo, and Angelo Tosca. And his main works include The Mirror of Development, The Political Culture of Italian Intellectuals in the Face of Industrialization, Left-Wing Anti-Stalinism and the Social Nature of the USSR, The University of Turin During Fascism, The Fate of Bureaucracy and the Dissolution of Trotskyism, in a book called Marxism from Radical to Institutional Thought, History of Europe with Giancarlo Jacques, Nicola Tranfaglia, The Universal Prejudice, Interpretations of Marx's Critique of Politics, Chronicle and History in the serial novel Corellina in Venezia, The Jacobin Myth and the Jacobin Model and the Jacobin Political Model and the Revolutions, The First International, Marxism and Anarchism, Utopian Socialism and the Genesis of Marxism, The Revision of Marxism and the Workers' Movement, Mass Society, Youth, World, and Crisis of Values, Socialist Thought in the 19th Century, The Replicas of History, Karl Marx Between the French Revolution and the Critique of Politics, The Tree of Revolution, Interpretations of the French Revolution, Large Geographical and Historical Atlas, Through the Interpretations of the French May in the Culture and Places of 68. I guess it's an article, a chapter in a book. Rereading the Cold War, In Teaching the Last 50 Years, Reflections on Identity and Methods of Contemporary History. The chapter, The Fascist Period in the University of Turin, Historical and Institutional Profile. Hegemony, Intellectuals, with Zygmunt Bauman, and Populism, an Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, Rome. The Contemporary World, Explanatory Notes and Bibliography in Norberto Bobbio, Ideological Profile of 20th Century Italy, published with Princeton University Press, 1995. Bellotti Borghieri, History of European Publishing, Volume 2. The Fall of Communism, 1995. Revolution, History of the Concept, in the book Search of Politics. Intellectuals, Culture, and Myths of the Post-War Period, published in History of Italy, Volume 5. Socialism, in the book Protestant Tradition and Historical Research, The Intellectual Commitment of Giorgio Spini. The Human Sciences, published in Guide to Contemporary Italy, 1861 to 1997. Oh shit, this list just goes on. Well, we've already started. Revolution, History of the Concept, Intellectuals, Culture, and Myths of the Post-War Period, Socialism and Protestant Tradition in Historical Research. The article Human Sciences and Guide to Contemporary Italy, 1861 to 1997. Nation and Nationalism in the 19th Century, Socialism in the 19th Century. The Idea of Nation and Socialism, published in Political Thought, Ideas, Theories, Doctrines, Volume 3. The Student and Worker Movement of 1968, The French Conquest, Epilogue of a Failed Insurrection, The University and the Academy, The Legal, Economic, Social, Statistical, Historical, Philosophical, and Philological Sciences, published in History of Turin. States and Nations Between Disordered International Order, published in Atlas of the 20th Century. The Age of Fascism, published in The History of the Faculty of Letters and Philosophy of the University of Turin. The City, the History, the Century, 100 Years of Historiography in Turin, published with Angelo D'Orsi and Patrizia Cancian. In the year 2000, From Utopia to Uchronia, with Gian Mario Bravo. Canon and History of United Italy, published in A Canon for the Third Millennium. Russia at the Beginning of the Century, Structural Transformations in Foreign Policy, published in A Journey and an Era, The Visit of Tsar Nicholas II to Rosaniji. Looks like he has a chapter, Rebel, Marx and Bonapartism, published in Bonapartism, Caesarism, and the Crisis of Society. From Marx to the Catastrophe of Communism, Trajectories and Antinomies of Socialism. The External Contract, published in 2004. The Age of Imperialism in the First World War. The Autobiography of a Nation, published in 100 Years, Piero Gobetti in the History of Italy. Totalitarianism, The Word and the Thing, published in The Catholic Church and Totalitarianism. It's from 2004. Marx and Democracy, published in Democracy Between Freedom and Tyranny of the Majority in the 19th Century. The Opposition to the Berlusconi Government, with Francesco Toccoli. Socialism Against the Nation, The Case of Amadeo Bordiga, 1911 to 1918, published in The Nation in Red by Soveria Manelli. Dude, these books sound great. Revisionism, History and Anti-History of a Word, published in Historians Tell Their Stories. The Ruling Classes in the History of Italy, with Nicola Tranfaglia. Historical Dictionary of United Italy, with Niccolo Tranfaglia. Totalitarianism, Le Mot et les... Oh, that's something in French. I can't say it. The Strength of Needs and the Reason for Freedom, Communism and the Liberal and Democratic Reflection of the 20th Century. The Concept of Empire, published in Empires and Imperialism, Imperial Models and Realities in the Western World. Marxism, published in The Isms of Politics. The Revision of Marxism between the end of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, published in The End of Socialism, Francesco Saverio Merlino and the Possible Anarchy. States, Nations, Democracies, Historiography and Political Journeys, History of the Cold War, Umberto Levra in Proceedings of the Academy of Sciences of Turin, and Intellectuals by Zygmunt Bauman and Bruno Bongiovanni, introduction by Emanuele Cosia, published in 2004. All right. I think we're, I just want to check something real quick. All right. Let's go. The Dissolution of Trotskyism. And like I said, this is originally published in a journal, an Italian journal called Anarchos, in the fall of 1979. So here we go. The older Trotsky thought that the end of capitalism was near. Trotsky's account of the transitory character of the bureaucracy, whereby the social nature of the USSR is purely a historical accident, must be seen in this context, notwithstanding the reservations of Deutscher and many other delegates. Footnote, quote, The International was little more than a fiction. None of its so-called executives and international bureaus have been able to work in the past few years. The, quote, sections of the International consisted of a few dozen or, at most, a few hundred members each. This was true even of the American section, the most numerous of all, which claimed a formal membership of 2,500, end quote. Isaac Deutscher, the prophet outcast. Here Deutscher explains all of his 1938 perplexities. He was still part of the Polish section that had voted against the founding, the quote, founding of the International. The founding occurred in the house of Alfred Rosmer at Perigny in the Paris suburbs, and the International was born, with 19 votes for and 3 against. End footnote. Notwithstanding the reservations of Deutscher and many other delegates, the Fourth International was formed in 1938. Thus, Trotsky's famous, quote, transitional program has the revealing title, The Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. With regard to the USSR, the primary objective remained, from 1936, the year of the revolution betrayed, the overthrow of a bureaucracy that perpetuated itself by means of violence and lies. Such overthrow, however, should have been preceded or accompanied by the collapse of capitalism, or at least a state of, quote, agony and decadence. It is precisely on such a premise that Trotskyists claimed that the formation of the Fourth International did not happen, quote, too soon, and that the transitional program was the only program drafted since the Communist Manifesto. Footnote. See Pierre Frank, Appunti per una storia della Quarta Internazionale. One second. I'm not seeing anything for that. Anyway, and footnote. These are the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, the Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, the Parti Ouvrier et Paysan, and l'Union Communiste Internationaliste. In addition to Frank's work, see also Richard Gambin, Les Projets Révolutionnaires, I'm not seeing anything about Richard Gambin, but it sounds like Richard Gambin has a introduction to the theory and history of council communism. Looks like he has some cool books on LibCom. Anyway, Le Projet Révolutionnaire, Quelques enseignements de notre histoire, I don't know. Yvan Crépieux, Le Mouvement Trotskyiste in France, Maurice Jacqueur. Who's that? Don't know who that is. I'm not seeing anything for them. Jean Rubin, Tout est possible. I have no idea. All right. Sorry about that. Back to the text. At the same time, Trotsky defended Bolshevik theory and practice against the attacks of those such as Max Eastman, Victor Serge, Siliga, or Souverine, who saw in it the historical roots of Stalinism. During the same years, moreover, the Trotskyist movement in France underwent a momentary decline. There were internal reasons for this. The opposition between Capu's POI and Frank's PCI, the problem of Pivert joining the PSOP, where men such as Daniel Guérin, Collinet, and Lefebvre were active, where men such as Daniel Guérin, Collinet, and Lefebvre were active, and the break with the Barta group. And there were also external reasons, due to the catastrophic consequences of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Quote, the ties with the International were cut, end quote. And the center of Trotskyism shifted from Paris to New York. Footnote. See Jacques Roussel, Les Enfants du Prophète. Don't see any description of that book. And footnote. Deutscher, the prophet outcast. In the United States, at least for a time, Trotskyism, quote, became something of a vogue which was to have many marks in American literature, end quote. Deutscher. It was frequently a salon fashion which, however, involved even prestigious personalities, such as Edmund Wilson, Sidney Hook, and Mary McCarthy. The hell's Mary McCarthy? Wikipedia says Mary McCarthy lived from 1912 to 1989, was an American novelist, critic, and political activist, best known for her novel The Group, her marriage to critic Edmund Wilson, and her storied feud with playwright Lillian Hellman. McCarthy was the winner of the Horizon Prize in 1949 and was awarded 2 Guggenheim Fellowships in 1949 and 1959. She was a member of the National Institute of Arts and Letters and the American Academy in Rome. In 1973, she delivered the Huizinga Lecture in Leiden, the Netherlands, under the title, Can There Be a Gothic Literature? The same year, she was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She won the National Medal for Literature and the Edward MacDowell Medal in 1984. Mary McCarthy held honorary degrees from Bard, Baldwin, Colby, Smith College, Syracuse University, the University of Maine at Orono, the University of Aberdeen, and the University of Hull. Back to the text. Counting on the sympathy of these intellectuals, Trotsky went through a counter-trial parallel to the one taking place in Moscow, in which the Dewey Commission concluded that there was absolutely no links between Trotsky and the crimes attributed to him by the Stalinist courts. Among other things, the most infamous accusation being that, quote, Trotskyists had sold out to Hitler and Mikado, end quote. Footnote. See trial proceedings of the Dewey Commission, the case of Leon Trotsky, report of hearings on the charges made against him in the Moscow trials. It's actually published in 1969. The Dutch Council Communist Otto Rula was also a member of the, quote, Preliminary Commission of Inquiry, while Dewey, at that time an emeritus professor at Columbia, was president. End footnote. Hence, this was a struggle of many fronts against the anti-Bolshevik Stalinophobia of many democratic intellectuals, against Stalinist terror and lies, against the neo-centrists, against the centrifugal tendencies inside the French movement, and later even within the American movement, and even against the ridiculous expression of, quote, socialist realism in Stalinist art, which led Trotsky to collaborate with Breton and Rivero on drafting a manifesto on the subject, end parenthesis. Footnote, see Arthur Schwartz, André Breton, and Leon Trotsky. Not seeing anything for that book. It's probably just Italian, an English translation of an Italian text. Anyway, end footnote. But when, following the Molotov-von Ribbentrop Pact, Trotsky's theoretical construct was shaken from the inside. Thanks to adherents and disciples such as Bruno Rizzi, James Burnham, and Max Shachtman, Trotsky felt he had to respond. Such a military pact with a fascist power should not necessitate a change in the interpretation of the substance of the Soviet social structure. If the USSR is a degenerate workers' democracy, where the dictatorship of the proletariat has been usurped by the Stalinist bureaucratic caste through the destruction of the old Bolshevik Guard, this state remains unchanged even after an alliance with Nazi Germany. The bureaucracy remains a caste and not a class, as Rizzi and some American Trotskyists claimed, and the Russian economy is still an economy in transition, not a, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. It is a possible intermediate stage of class repressive nature between a dying capitalism and a socialism still far on the historical horizon. Trotsky tried in every way to reject the doubts insinuated by those who, thinking along similar lines, had sought to eliminate contradictions increasingly difficult to sustain. But the doubts remained. Trotsky claimed that, quote, if the current war did not cause a revolution, but only a proletarian decline, there was only one alternative, the eventual degeneration of monopoly capitalism, its fusion with the state and the replacement of democracy, wherever it still survives, with a totalitarian regime, end quote. Trotsky, the USSR in war. In that case, i.e., if according to the 1914-17 Leninist scheme, the war is not transformed into a revolution, everything has to be revised. Not just the question of the social nature of the USSR, but also the assessment of a whole century. Moreover, the very legitimacy of Marxism as the science of the proletariat would have to be questioned. Of course, there is no point in debating what opinions Trotsky might have developed if the Soviet dictator's assassins had spared his life. The reflections of the older Trotsky, however, are fundamental for understanding and evaluating the evolution of the Trotskyist movement up to our time. Actually, Trotsky risked a lot with the above statements and made considerable concessions to theoreticians of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, especially Bruno Rizzi. The alternative is not just between socialism and bureaucratic totalitarian barbarism, but also between the victory of the communist program and the triumph of theories such as those of Rizzi and his U.S. imitators. Once again, Trotsky took it upon himself to free his successors from any embarrassment likely to arise from his formulation, by resolving the question of territories occupied by the Red Army following Nazi-Soviet partition. If simple fascist-type control is established over Polish-occupied territories by the bureaucracy without expropriating the bourgeoisie, it will then become necessary to revise the nature of the Soviet state. Parenthesis, why indeed? Didn't Trotsky himself state that the social structure of the Soviet regime is independent from its foreign policy? End parenthesis. But if the bourgeoisie is expropriated, then the Stalinist Bonapartist bureaucracy will take measures of, quote, a revolutionary character, the expropriation of the expropriators, to be effected in a military bureaucratic fashion, end quote. Trotsky, the USSR in war. Based on this assessment, post-war Trotskyists would claim that Trotsky's prediction had been fulfilled, especially in view of the reality of Stalinism's geographical expansion. Worker states will multiply, having been already deformed and degenerate. This means that for Trotsky, at that time, in contrast to earlier years, a proletarian revolution was no longer necessary to define a, quote, worker state. Certain features of a transitional economy, parenthesis, nationalization, would be sufficient. A worker state could thus emerge without a revolution, by importing from abroad, parenthesis, or by forcefully submitting to, end parenthesis, certain structural characteristics, or else it could become a worker state through a revolution that, although degenerate and ill-conceived because led by Stalinist parties, was still progressive, as would be the case in China and Cuba, parenthesis, concerning the latter, however, not all Trotskyists agree, end parenthesis. Such waverings date back to the dawn of the new Trotskyism, the one recycled from the turbulent events of World War II. In a text dated October 18, 1939, Trotsky realized that he had conceded too much to Rizzi's formulation. Parenthesis, note here that in 1939-40, American Trotskyists who were polemicizing with the Socialist Workers' Party majority were only saying that the USSR was neither a bourgeois nor a workers' state, end parenthesis, and defended revolutionary optimism against the, quote, deeper historical pessimism, end quote. Trotsky, the USSR in war. Typical of supporters of the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. In any case, it is clear that if Trotsky is wrong, Bruno Rizzi must be right. There is no third possibility for Trotsky. Quote, if the Bonapartist outgrowth is not a class, clearly it is a monstrosity. Clearly it is not a monstrosity, but a valid parturition of history. What the hell does that mean? Parturition. Parturition means the action of giving birth to young. Childbirth means childbirth. Let me repeat that last sentence. In any case, it is clear that if Trotsky is wrong, Bruno Rizzi must be right. There is no third possibility for Trotsky. Quote, if the Bonapartist outgrowth is not a class, clearly it is not a monstrosity, but a valid parturition of history. If gangster parasitism is exploitation in the scientific sense of the term, from the historical viewpoint, this means that bureaucracy is a future as the ruling class necessary to a given economic system. End quote. Trotsky. The USSR at war. Clearly this looks like a demonstration of the absurd. Trotsky is certain, parenthesis, or almost certain, end parenthesis, that the imminent collapse of world capitalism and the subsequent overthrow of the Kremlin's gangsters will also sweep away the hypothesis of an entire historical cycle dominated by the bureaucracy. But the important thing is that, in the case of proletarian defeat and imperialist victory, Trotsky hypothesizes the totalitarian regime of the bureaucratic degeneration. From here on, the Russian question starts growing inside the Trotskyist theoretical system to assume abnormal proportions that succeed in wiping out all other parts of the system. Yet once again, in a December 15th text, the possibility of a, quote, universal bureaucratic, end quote, future is exercised through the alibi the earlier Trotsky had provided on the issue of occupied Polish territories and on the Russo-Finnish War, understood as a bureaucratic revolutionary war. After stating that, quote, without the social structure created by the October Revolution, the USSR would be a fascist regime, end quote. Trotsky writes, quote, Comrade Cannon, sorry, I think that might be a typo. Trotsky writes, quote, Comrade Cannon is absolutely right in saying that the role of Stalinism in Spain has been far more criminal than in either Poland or Finland. In the first case, the bureaucracy has strangulated a socialist revolution by the executioner's method. In the second, it provides impetus for a socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods, end quote. Trotsky, the petty bourgeois opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party, which is on this channel. It says, C. Cannon's The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. Where am I? At this point, the contradictions explode. While keeping an eye on the falling rate of profit, the index of capitalist agony, Trotsky is also forced to quantify the Stalinist crime rate. Still, Trotsky's later writings and his political legacy remain connected with a triple prediction. 1. International communist and proletarian revolution. 2. Bureaucratic collectivism. 3. Territorial expansion of Stalinism in Eastern and Baltic Europe, with the subsequent creation of new worker states, the deformed offspring of a, quote, worker and, quote, degenerate father. It remains unclear whether in the absence of the first possibility, the second and third one would emerge. This was certainly not the case for Trotskyists in the years that followed, and the third possibility was accepted because it alone allowed the retention of the Trotskyist interpretation of the social nature of the USSR, despite its clearly provisional character. The pessimistic problematic of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, at once rejected and feared by Trotsky, was later replaced by the problematic of societies in transition as, quote, expressions of bourgeois forms of distribution, end quote. Trotsky's most developed analysis appears in The Revolution Betrayed, in which he dealt with the contradiction between a productive system which is no longer capitalist and a distributive system which is still bourgeois, i.e. a contradiction, quote, based on the fact that the mode of production anticipates the development of productive forces, end quote. Trotsky. Wait, no. I missed a footnote here, sorry. Footnote. Quaderni di Rouge in The Bureaucracy. Rouge was the daily, not now weekly, organ of the French Ligue Communiste. Okay. So let me repeat the last sentence. Trotsky's most developed analysis appeared in The Revolution Betrayed, in which Trotsky dealt with the contradictions between a productive system which is no longer capitalist and a distributive system which is still bourgeois, i.e. a contradiction, quote, based on the fact that the mode of production anticipates the development of productive forces, end quote. I'm not sure who that quote is from. I don't know if it's from this article, Quaderni di Rouge, or it's Trotsky. It sounds like Trotsky. In societies of transition, where the transitional characteristics tend to last because of an inadequate development of the forces of production and because of political resistance from the bureaucracy, the following phenomena can be observed. Quote, the state grows stronger and becomes increasingly omnipresent. Mercantile economy and social inequality gain in stability and strength. Bureaucratic distortion becomes stable and institutionalized, and acquires the most monstrous forms of political expropriation of the workers, the state administration, and the economy, end quote. After World War II and Trotsky's assassination, the Trotskyist movement underwent many shifts. Shachtman's group retained control of the New International, founded by the Workers' Party, and during McCarthyism eased itself into traditional social democratic positions. There was a split in the late 1950s between those who went in Shachtman's direction and those who went in who continued to adhere to some kind of third camp from below socialism, such as Hal Draper and Julius Jacobson. Carrying on. Towards the end of the war, a group of ex-Trotskyists also founded the journal Politics, whose editorial board included old European militants such as Karl Korsch and Ruth Fischer. That's interesting. I did read that I did read that Karl Korsch and Ruth Fischer did have a correspondence, even though they came from kind of different worlds. I think it took a while for Karl Korsch to. I think Ruth Fischer. It took her a little more longer to be. I think she was a little more tainted by like. Bureaucracy and dogma in the early period than Korsch was. I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying. Yeah, sorry, I'm talking my ass. I was like doing two things at once. I was like looking up to see if there's anything on this journal, Politics, which, as you can imagine, is extremely difficult to look up. The journal's leading ideologue was Dwight MacDonald. Okay. It looks like they have politics, or at least like a decent amount of politics on Libcom, actually. Yeah, yeah, it's got a lot of stuff in it. Yeah, interesting. Let me look at the Wikipedia. Just so I can look at the introduction, because this is actually a fairly involved Wikipedia. Politics, styled as Politics, I guess with an lowercase p, was a journal founded and edited by Dwight MacDonald from 1944 to 1949. MacDonald had previously been editor of Partisan Review from 1937 to 1943, but after falling out with Partisan Review's publishers, quit to start Politics as a rival publication, first on a monthly basis and then as a quarterly. Politics published essays on politics and culture and included, among its contributors, James Agee, John Berryman, Bruno Bettelheim, Paul Goodman, C. Wright Mills, Mary McCarthy, Marianne Moore, Irving Howe, Daniel Bell, and Hannah Arendt. The journal reflected MacDonald's interest in European culture. MacDonald used Politics to introduce U.S. readers to the thinking of the French philosopher Simone Weil. There's a piece by Simone Weil titled "Prospects: Are We Headed for Proletarian Revolution?" or something like that on the channel. There's actually a piece by Dwight MacDonald on the channel as well about Nazi Germany. Dwight MacDonald used Politics to introduce U.S. readers to the thinking of the French philosopher Simone Weil, publishing several articles by her, including a poem of force, her reflections on the Iliad. He also printed work by Albert Camus, another European. The Italian political and literary critic Nicola Sciarmonte was also given space in the journal. Politics was also MacDonald's vehicle for his repeated and energetic attack against Henry Wallace and his progressive campaign his Progressive Party campaign for president. In a letter to Philip Robb at the end of December 1943, George Orwell mentioned that MacDonald had written asking him to contribute to his forthcoming journal. Orwell had replied telling him he might, quote, do something, quote, cultural, but not, quote, political, as he was already writing his, quote, London letters to Partisan Review. In his, quote, As I Please article of the 16th of June 1944 issue of Tribune, George Orwell recommended politics. Orwell stated that he disagreed with its policy but admired its, quote, combination of highbrow political analysis with intelligent literary criticism, end quote. Orwell went on to add that there were no monthly or quarterly magazines in England, quote, to come up to, end quote, the American ones, of which there were several. MacDonald, in an editorial comment for the November 1944 issue of Politics, referred to a letter from Orwell which cast interesting light on the, quote, Russification of English political thought over the last 2 years. Orwell had read the May issue review of Harold Lasky. Well, Harold Lasky was like I think he was like a socialist in the Labour Party. Yeah. Faith, Reason, and Civilization, and mentioned that the Manchester Evening News, the evening edition of the Manchester Guardian, had refused to print his own review because of its anti-Stalin implications. Despite considering the book pernicious tripe, Orwell had praised the author for being, quote, aware that the USSR is the real dynamo of the socialist movement in this country and everywhere else, end quote. But criticized him for shutting his eyes to, quote, purges, liquidations, quote, etc. I guess that's praised Harold Lasky. Is the he's referring to? I don't know. MacDonald pointed out that the fact that such a review should be considered, quote, too hot shows how much the feats of the Red Army had misled the English public opinion about Russia. He added that the, quote, English liberal press had been far more honest about the Moscow trials than our own liberal journals, end quote, and that Trotsky had been able to write in the Guardian. All right, so thank you for that detour. Back to the text. Toward the end of the war, a group of ex-Trotskyists also founded the journal Politics. Its editorial board included old European militants such as Karl Korsch and Ruth Fischer. The journal's leading ideologue was Dwight MacDonald, who took up the thesis of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, and in response to the impossibility of otherwise defeating the monstrous Leviathan, advocated an ethical individual rebellion. Furthermore, the process of partial disintegration of American Trotskyism gave birth to the, quote, Workers' League for a Revolutionary Party, end quote, which published 2 journals, Political Correspondence, and International News. These continued to define the USSR as a proletarian state with counter-revolutionary tendencies, and to condemn the tactics of the Fourth International as, quote, morbid with respect to imperialist democracies and neo-reformist in its remaining suspended between the two. After 1946, Trotskyists from the Fourth International Spanish section in Mexico, primarily Peralta and Muniz, completely revised Trotsky's theory concerning the social nature of the USSR. Peralta, which it might be a pseudonym for Benjamin Pérez, denounced unequivocally the open and violent shift from national communism to counter-revolution, to conclude that all formulations seeing progressive elements in the Soviet economy were inconsistent. It looks like it might have been published in a Bordigist journal. Isn't Prometeo Bordigist? Yeah, it looks like it. Let me look up what that is. Yeah, I think. Sorry, I'm looking at Trotskyist pseudonyms. Per Alta. Yeah, that's Benjamin. Or Ben. It's either Benjamin or Benjamin Pare, or maybe it's Benjamin. I don't know. Um, he's French, so how do you say Benjamin in French? Yeah.
Benjamin in French.
Benjamin. I wonder why I typed in Benjamin in French. One second.
Benjamin.
Benjamin. Looks like it might be how it's pronounced. Yeah. One second. Yeah, Benjamin Pare. All right. Sorry about that. Where the hell am I? After 1946, Trotskyists from the Fourth International Spanish section to Mexico, primarily Peralta and Muniz, completely revised Trotsky's theory concerning the social nature of the USSR. Peralta denounced unequivocally the open and violent shift from national communism to counter-revolution, to conclude that all formulations seeing progressive elements in the Soviet economy are inconsistent. Muniz, on the other hand, reiterated the growing sense of unease among those who could not accept the image of a social regime, both economically progressive and politically reactionary, and of Stalinism as a transitory outgrowth on the body of a socialist productive base. Muniz described the perfectly capitalist character of nationalizations, the importance of workers' reformism for capital, and interpreted the Soviet Stalinist bureaucracy not as a workers' bureaucracy, as orthodox Trotskyism would have it, but as a social class pure and simple, quote, whose definite structure is on the road to crystallization, and in order to become crystallized it must smother proletarian revolutions elsewhere, end quote. This phenomenon is discernible since the Spanish War, according to Muniz, Jalones de Derrota, Promesa de Victoria, an important and interesting volume written in exile in Mexico between 1943 and 1947, and a useful document for understanding the rejection crisis that hit many Trotskyist militants. An actual witness to the Stalinist horrors during the Spanish Civil War, Muniz succeeds, after making indirect concessions to the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, in defining Russian state capitalism and the police dictatorship it established as, quote, forms of the decadence of civilization, end quote. With the crisis and disintegration of the American movement, in the immediate post-war era, the center of attraction for international Trotskyism shifted to Paris, although sections of the Fourth International also developed in Latin America, Asia, and Ceylon. After then, the history of Trotskyism became the history of the French Trotskyist movement, at times well organized with open-minded theoreticians and able journalists equipped with a fairly active and alert press. The great importance in that connection is La Vérité, which existed from 1940 to 1944, the clandestine Trotskyist newspaper that continued publication during the Nazi occupation of France. Thus, the contradiction between proletarian and national struggle became apparent, with the national struggle eventually prevailing as anti-German resistance won over revolutionary internationalism. Crépieu's group was mainly responsible for the rapprochement with National Front policy. while Frank and Barto's groups remained closer to theoretical premises. Footnote: Crépieu's group is POI, Frank's the PCI, and Barto's the UCI, today Lutte Ouvrière. After a brief After a brief reconstitution of united organizations in the post-war years, the movement was considerably weakened by a number of losses, some of which, such as the one that resulted in the creation of the Socialisme Barbarie group, drastically questioned the entire Trotskyist platform. The dissolution of Trotskyism created further problems. The unresolved doubts of the later Trotsky and the still open confrontation with the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism began to reappear. For Fourth International exponents such as Michel Pablo, I have a little biography of Pablo on this channel, the war is again imminent and revolutionaries must support socially progressive regimes in the East because they represent a historical phase that might well last a century. The transition phase, i.e. the one dominated by an ephemeral parasitic caste, creates a mode of production unforeseen by Marx and wedges itself unexpectedly between capitalism and socialism. Yet it represents a, quote, more advanced, end quote, stage, and as such must be supported. The USSR has a, quote, regime which is the, quote, regime which is the vestibule of socialism, end quote. Footnote: Michel Pablo, Le Guerre qui vient. A militant originally from Greece, Pablo's real name is Raptis. End footnote. The relations of production being consolidated in Russia, in people's democracies, and in China are not the product of an organic evolution, but of the class struggle that has led to the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. The East-West War, which seemed likely in the early 1950s, is another phase of this expropriation. In this war revolution, revolutionaries must support that part of the world that is historically closer to socialism. Pablo's account is interesting both for its loyalty and disloyalty to Trotsky's thought. Pablo's account develops Trotsky's thought, while the business of centuries of transition simply echoes, without Pablo realizing it, the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, which did not consider bureaucratic collectivist regimes progressive. The theoretical difference is significant, yet unavoidable. For Trotsky, the Soviet degenerate workers' state is a historical accident, an abnormal phenomenon that lives an amphibious life in the lacerating contradictions between forms of production and distribution. For Pablo in the USSR, there are, quote, new relations of production, end quote, that are a necessary stage in human evolution and a determining and, quote, immensely progressive element. Pablo. These relations make it possible for worker states to have a prodigious economic development. Among other things, this shows how much benefit humanity might derive from them if they were generalized. The historical process initiated with Red October aims at the generalization of economies of transition and the universalization of worker states. Now, until all wars, including World War II, until now all wars, including World War II, were inter-imperialistic. Those to come, and Pablo seems to await them enthusiastically, will find imperialism grouped on one side and the economies of transition on the other. These wars will be the form of future revolutions. As such, Trotskyism's autonomy in the face of Stalinism acquires new dimensions. Pablo's positions are almost a sellout, but the shift from Trotskyism to such positions is not illogical. Pierre Franck and Ernest Mandel of the French section and James Cannon of the American one later accepted Pablo's view. Lambert's group did not, because it maintained that the imperialist war must be opposed with revolution. Footnote. Stéphane Jus, Defense du Trotskyism, La Vérité, 1965, end footnote. The Lambertist group view, quote, in the Lambertist view, quote, Pabloists, end quote, were selling out the Fourth International for the benefit of Stalinist bureaucracy. They therefore claimed it was necessary to proceed to the reconstruction of the Fourth International. Footnote, the Lambertists became the Organisation Communiste Internationale. Members of the group are the historians Pierre Bourret and Jean-Jacques Marie. Since then, parenthesis, 1952 to 53, the Korean years, end parenthesis, the break inside the Trotskyist movement has only been partially mended. Following these breaks, Pabloists underwent some self-criticism. Pablo himself became more cautious in his predictions, shifted his attention and political militancy towards anti-colonial revolutions, and finally, after his 1956 exclusion from the Fourth International, put together with a few faithful followers his own organization. Footnote, this organization was the Alliance Marxiste Revolutionnaire, which Pablo believed to be a revolutionary tendency of the Fourth International. The Alliance Marxiste Revolutionnaires program advocates support for workers' states, the priority of anti-colonial revolutions, and the self-management of capitalist metropoles. End footnote. It would be laborious to retrace the often boring details of disputes between Pabloist and Lambertist, even on the central theme, the social nature of the USSR. There is little difference between the two currents on this question. They are both tenaciously faithful to Trotsky's writings. There are some differences concerning the problem of worker states resulting from popular democracies. For Pabloists, and after Pablo's departure for Frank, Mandel, and Maitan, Stalinist bureaucracy has carried out a revolutionary task by introducing its own relations of production outside its own national boundaries. For Lambertists, on the other hand, the phantasmagoric proletarian revolution that occurred in Eastern countries has been strangled by the Stalinist bureaucracy. Parenthesis, this is how the enigma of worker states without a proletarian revolution is solved by the, quote, Frank Group, with Pablo's blessings, via a theory that directly replaces revolution with nothing less than war among states, end parenthesis. Clearly things become more and more complicated. They grow outright muddled concerning the problems of China, Cuba, and in general, questions raised by anti-colonial revolutions. For the Frank Group, all so-called socialist states are degenerate worker states. For Lambertists, worker states are those states where there has been a revolution. In Eastern Europe, this revolution was inverted, while in China, the Communist Party, although Stalinist, is said to have filled in for the lack of an industrial proletariat, end parentheses. Thus, in relation to the Frank Group, parenthesis, which is today the Ligue Communiste under Alain Krivine, they exclude Cuba from the worker states category, for although there was a Cuban revolution, it was bourgeois, and the fact that Cuba later sided with the USSR and other worker states does not redeem Cuba's bourgeois origins. Parenthesis, native nobility is what counts for Lambertists. End parenthesis. Undoubtedly, the most serious and principled of Trotskyist groups, but also most sclerotically attached to a hypostatization of the thought of the later Trotsky, is the XUCI, parenthesis, which de Gaulle dissolved after May 68, together with Frank's PCI and Lambert's OCI, in parenthesis. This group publishes the weekly Lutte Ouvrière, which is also the name of the group. Lutte Ouvrière's members believe that the only worker state, however incredibly degenerated, remains the USSR, since, they claim, it is impossible to believe in the dogma of immaculate conception. Quote, for a Marxist, a worker state can result only from a victorious proletarian revolution, and no holy ghost, not even the Red Army, can substitute for the working class in accomplishing its historical tasks. End quote. Lutte Ouvrière remained faithful to the early Trotsky, who, in terms of the permanent revolution, maintained that the proletarian meaning of a proletarian state depended on the dictatorship established via victorious revolution. Like Trotsky, Lutte Ouvrière considers the terms, quote, degenerate worker state, end quote, acceptable for describing only the USSR, since that country's proletariat has actually pushed the revolution to its successful outcome, has destroyed the old state apparatus, and has effectively built its own state. In contrast, in people's democracies, the proletariat never took power, never overthrew the bourgeois state, and has never proclaimed its own dictatorship. It is a very unsatisfactory way of formulating the problem, since it shifts all difficulties to the analysis of the Russian state. The USSR's relation to people's democracies can only be of an imperialist type unless there is a process that other Trotskyists call, quote, structural assimilation, end quote. You see that word sometimes. I didn't know it was particularly Trotskyist. It will be remembered that this was also Trotsky's problem when he wrote that, if nothing should change in occupied territories, it would be necessary to think over the problem of the social nature of the USSR. Yet, it was Trotsky himself who regarded the occupation of Poland and Russia's war with Finland, hailed as, quote, revolutionary, the action of the Red Army outside its national frontier. Thus, even Lutte Ouvrière, which in comparison to the sudden twists and turns of all other Trotskyist movements, has displayed a respectable consistency, cannot manage to rid itself of contradictions rooted deeply in Trotsky's own thought. Lutte Ouvrière has consistently held that China, Cuba, and Vietnam were not worker states, since in those countries proletarian autonomy has turned out to be non-existent. These revolutions were peasant in character and guided by a leadership with bourgeois roots that became radicalized in an anti-imperialist nationalist sense. In the post-war period, there have been groups that, while starting from Trotskyist positions, have rejected the Fourth Internationalist interpretation of the social nature of the USSR. These were Muniz's Spanish section in exile, which also entered into a controversy of James Cannon's U.S., quote, orthodoxy. Footnote, see Muniz and James P. Cannon, What Policy for Revolutionists, Marxism or Ultra-Leftism. One second. I've never heard of this book before, so that's very interesting. It's available at Marxist.org as a PDF. How big is this thing? Looking at it, 67 pages. It looks like it's about the Minneapolis trial, which I don't know what the hell This is about where am I? So maybe start reading the footnote. Munice's views are followed by the group Fomento Obrero Revolucionario, which publishes Alarma, a Paris periodical. See also Muniz pour un second manifeste communiste and Les Syndicats contre la Révolution, published in Paris 1968. And footnote. Where am I? Come on. See, I look up a footnote and then I can't find the number again in the text because it's small. Anyway, okay, here we are. There was Muniz's Spanish section in exile, which also entered into a controversy with James Cannon's U.S., quote, orthodoxy. In France, Pinetier and the surrealist poet Benjamin Péré joined Muniz's views. Also, Muniz kept in touch with Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's widow, who since the war years had sided against the official line of the Fourth International's executive committee. I actually have a letter. I've read the letter from Péré, Muniz, and Sedova to the Fourth International. After the Executive Council approved Pablo's aberrant theories, on May 9, 1951, Natalia Sedova wrote a letter to the executive of the International, where, among other things, there was specific reference to the question of the USSR. Quote, by now it should be clear to everyone that the revolution has been completely destroyed by Stalinism. Nonetheless, you continue to claim that under such a regime Russia is still a worker state. Stalinism and such a worker state have absolutely nothing in common with a worker state and socialism. They're the most dangerous enemies of socialism and of the working class. End quote. Natalia Sedova Trotsky. Obviously, Sedova had accepted Muniz's positions along with those of Alfred and Marguerite Rosmer, with whom Sedova was in close contact. During the war, Sedova had also remained close to Victor Serge, who had also emigrated to Mexico. End parenthesis. I don't know if I said parenthesis the first time, but that was in parentheses. But when Natalia Sedova Trotsky broke with the Fourth International, her position was closer to Alfred Rosmer's sanguine but generic view than to Muniz's organic, coherent view. Sedova was not able to find a logical or quote structural reasons for the USSR's loss of its workers' characteristics. She only protested in indignation against a regime that developed constantly shameless nationalist and repressive policies. She rejected the executive's assessment of popular democracies. She considered them vassals of the USSR, of the Korean War, of the probably imminent Third World War, and of Tito's regime. Thus, the Fourth International had betrayed her husband's principles, even if it claimed to be the organization propagating his principles. A year before Sedova took this position, C.L.R. James, who I have a biography and several pieces by James on this channel if you're interested, who earlier had been very close to Trotsky, broke not just with the rising Pablism, but also with Trotsky's analysis concerning the social nature of the USSR. James espoused Lenin's views on state capitalism and showed, even if superficially, how they were bound to differ from Trotsky's. James maintained that, in its dying stage, the state form was totally compatible with capitalism, and the latter was in no way demolished by nationalizations and planning. Footnote. See James's State Capitalism and World Revolution, which is on this channel. One of Trotsky's fundamental concepts was still preserved, i.e., the picture of the present as capitalism's agony. James interpreted state capitalism as the final anguished reaction of a mode of production trying to delay its own disappearance. Thus, James remained within the realm of the ephemeral and transitory. The messianic expectations of the Fourth International kept alive by the utopian hope of heretics and dissidents. Aside from this, James's analysis is very interesting. James denounced the fact that Pablo's strategy, which followed logically from some of Trotsky's formulations, quote, destroys the historical necessity of the Fourth International, end quote. James, State Capitalism and World Revolution. By overvaluing Stalinist parties as revolutionary and proletarian parties, for James the moment had come to discuss Trotsky's theoretical defects, in view of the fact that he had spawned positions such as Pablo's. Trotsky's fundamental shortcoming consisted in his having always considered Stalinism a reformist betrayal, an anti-revolutionary innovation promoted by the Stalinist bureaucracy, which usurped the proletarian dictatorship rather than as a specific contemporary historical phenomenon, comparable to the American trade union support of U.S. capitalism. Stalinism is not a bureaucratic deviation in respect to revolutionary Bolshevism. It is an organic contribution toward building state capitalism in the USSR. Stalinism is no accident produced by casual circumstances such as the defeat of World Revolution. Taking advantage of this defeat, Stalinism has become the irreplaceable instrument of capitalist accumulation in the USSR. James claimed that in the same way that social democracy is the workers' bureaucracy necessary for the development of private capitalism, Stalinism is a workers' bureaucracy necessary for capitalism in its state form. Stalinism is workers' bureaucracy necessary for capitalism in its state form. According to James, quote, Stalinists do not support class collaboration. They are the mortal enemies of capitalist private property. They seek to seize hold of power and to take the place of the bourgeoisie. End quote. James. End quote. No. Yeah, James. State Capitalism, World Revolution. See also Raya Dunayevskaya, Russia as State Capitalism. Naturally, this analysis reflects the Cold War climate of the early 1950s. These two economies, far from irreducibly rival, were at many times shown profoundly complementary. Aside from James, this was also argued by the Socialism or Barbarie group and by Pablo, who nevertheless supported one of the struggling camps. James's position made it possible to overcome some of the contradictions of orthodox Trotskyism and were similar to the positions of Socialisme ou Barbarie. In fact, James and Pastoriadis and Grace Lee Boggs collaborated on a book called Facing Reality in the later 1950s. The absurdity of revisionism was put aside. Stalinists stopped being considered mere revisionists of a once immaculate doctrine and were instead seen in terms of their historical and materialist roots. Thus, the dissolution of Trotskyism allowed for the rise of fresh viewpoints. In 1955, Tony Cliff, an English Trotskyist, wrote an interesting book on what had led to the rejection of Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a degenerated workers' state. According to the Cliff, the first 5-year plan at the end of the 1920s was far from being the exalted moment where the bureaucracy was forced to submit to joint pressures from the opposition and from the irresistibly, quote, progressive character of the Soviet state, parenthesis, Trotsky's view, in parenthesis. Rather, the plan signaled a point of near return in the development of relations of distribution and relations between accumulation and consumption, between work productivity and the worker's standard of living, and the development of generalized control of production and of the institution of forced labor. For Cliff, bureaucrats were convinced they were building socialism in one country, while instead they were constructing state capitalism. which is indeed a stage in the transitional process to socialism, but at the same time is radically opposed to socialism. It follows that the bureaucracy is a social class, i.e. a ruling class, one that controls the entire productive process, even though, compared to private capitalism, the bureaucracy only draws relative advantages with respect to personal appropriation. In fact, the particularity of the capitalist mode of production is not personal consumption by individual capitalists, but rather accumulation for its own sake. In the USSR, this phenomenon has reached the highest level. Quote, the Russian bureaucracy, by owning the state and by controlling the accumulation process, is the personification of capital in its purest form, ... The Russian bureaucracy, as a partial negation of the traditional capitalist class, is at the same time the most authentic personification of the historical mission of that class. End quote. Cliff. Where am I? This interesting analysis not only marks the definitive disintegration of Trotskyist doctrine, but also parallels the implications drawn by Socialisme ou Barbarie, especially in defining the USSR's social system as, quote, bureaucratic state capitalism, end quote. Cliff's study clearly indicates that according to Trotsky's law of unequal and combined development, the USSR is not an intermediate or frozen stage between two modes of production and two forms of civilization, but the fullest realization of capitalism. There is also the suggestion, later picked up by certain sectors of the left-wing anti-Stalinism, that the evolution of world capitalism aims at the perfection of the Russian form. Footnote: for an analysis of Cliff's International Socialism Group, see Chris Harman, How the Revolution Was Lost, published in 1969. That's not going to be an impartial analysis because Chris Harman was part of Cliff's tendency and a follower of Tony Cliff. End footnote. According to Trotsky, the Russian state had moved so far ahead that it could readily leave the capitalist universe behind. Thus, the USSR remained an enigmatic case. For Cliff and an entire current of left anti-Stalinists, the USSR came to be seen as the culmination of capitalism's historical evolution from the viewpoint of form and mechanism, and not, of course, in terms of profitability, which depended on the quantitative level of productive forces. Inefficient, and it could not have been otherwise, as a producer of mass consumer goods, bureaucratic state capitalism in the USSR is at the same time the most advanced manifestation of the laws of capital, of capital's organization of labor, and capital's way of structuring social classes. Everyone must have learned from the Soviet state, according to Cliff. Its planned war economy has been a worldwide means, coercive with respect to labor, power, and sometimes individual capitalists, that has propelled humanity from private capitalism first to monopolistic state capitalism, and then to state capitalism now realized in a totalitarian way only in countries that Trotskyists persist in calling worker states. Of course, for Cliff, there is an important difference between capitalist states with a history of private capitalism and capitalism in the USSR. In the former, advanced capitalism has to coexist with strong sectors of private property, which tend to weaken the primitive autonomy of the productive machinery controlled by the state, while in the USSR, private property is wholly absent from Russian state capitalism, emerged from a genuinely proletarian revolution, which gave rise to a worker state, later degenerated and finally died. Fulfilling its task, the proletarian revolution in backward Russia has freed a large quantity of productive forces, but having remained internationally isolated, these productive forces have been channeled toward building the most perfect and spectacular form of state capitalism, perfect enough to become a stimulus and a model for the structuring of other states, parenthesis, note here the radical transformation introduced by the British Labour government during and immediately after World War II. Naturally, backwardness has persisted in parts of Russia, and this reveals the contradictions between the rationality of the form, parenthesis, high concentration and high organic composition of capital, end parenthesis, and low labor productivity, conditions that result in the masses' low cultural and living standards. In any case, for Cliff, the worker state has clearly had a real historical substance, despite the fact that in its state form, capitalism has been restored. From 1917 to 1923, Russia was a worker state. Thus, up to that date, Cliff's interpretation coincides with Trotsky's and agrees with his view concerning the beginning of the degenerative phase. A degenerate worker state existed uneasily up to 1928, to subsequently dissolve due partly to the absence of the world revolution and partly to the bureaucracy. Actually, for Cliff, a state is a worker state when subject to workers' control, which he claims was the case until 1923. Afterward, this control declined as the decision power of the state's bureaucratic apparatus increased. With the first 5-year plan, the worker state finally died and the bureaucracy became the totalitarian arbiter of development. The transition from a degenerate worker state to state capitalism is for Cliff logically possible. If the proletariat must break the existing state machine in order to establish its own state, the capitalist class can utilize the existing state machinery for its own ends. This is precisely what the bureaucracy did. Helped by its relative compactness and the absence of privately owned means of production, the bureaucracy suppressed proletarian state control and replaced it with its own. In short, with Trotsky, Cliff also believes in the existence of a worker state economy as a specific economic form. Unlike Cliff's master, however, Cliff defines its specific content on a, quote, subjective level as well, i.e. in terms of workers' control. Unlike the Dutch Council Communists, Cliff extends the history of workers' management to 1923, parenthesis, in this case, the choice of date appears as a mechanical repetition of the, quote, political date proposed and imposed by Trotsky's biography. For Cliff, Trotsky's contradiction consists in his supposing the historical possibility of a worker state without workers' control. But the paradox in Cliff's critique of Trotsky consists in Cliff's placing the beginning of the consolidation of state capitalism precisely during the years when, for Trotsky, the major danger represented by the kulaks was coming to an end, and when Stalin's, quote, centrist rule was forced to turn left, to accept badly and partially the platform of the left opposition. It was just this platform, parenthesis, total nationalizations plus generalized planning plus forced industrialization, in parenthesis, that allowed the bureaucracy, by now a class through the elimination of the last vestiges of workers' control, to initiate the intensive and brutal process of capitalist development. According to Cliff, while in the worker state before it degenerated, the leading role in production belonged for the most part to the workers who subordinated the technical needs of accumulation to their own needs. In state capitalism, absolute planning pitilessly destroyed needs from below. Let me repeat that, I got spaced out. According to Cliff, while in the worker state before it degenerated, the leading role in production belonged for the most part, to the workers who subordinated the technical needs of accumulation to their own needs. In state capitalism, absolute planning pitilessly destroyed needs from below, posed accumulation as an end in itself, and robbed workers of all autonomy. In the last analysis, the Stalinist counter-revolution was to abolish entirely all workers' control in order to realize the most frenzied and barbaric capitalist accumulation in history. Somewhat similar to Cliff's views are those of Raya Dunayevskaya, Trotsky's ex-secretary. Dunayevskaya parted with Trotsky after the German-Soviet Pact. In contrast to Cliff's rigor, Dunayevskaya, who after the war turned to humanist Marxism, developed a far more general and less documented analysis of the USSR by relying on some striking external features without dealing in detail with the process that led to state capitalism. Dunayevskaya defined the Soviet state, quote, as a worker state with deviations that allowed for free trade, end quote, and spoke of the, quote, rebirth of capital, end quote, without specifying its mechanism and historical forms. For Dunayevskaya, too, the counter-revolution ripens and triumphs with the establishment of a totalitarian capitalist plan. But the structural categories of this stage, in contrast to Cliff, are never satisfactorily explained, and her anti-Stalinist polemics, though deeply motivated by libertarian ideas, often risk falling into the usual stream of anti-totalitarian and generally Stalinophobic invectives. Quote, Orthodox Trotskyism also has a recent history. By far the best-known member of the Fourth International's ruling group is the Belgian economist Ernest Mandel, officially entrusted with the classical Trotskyist interpretation of the social nature of the USSR and with the rejection of opposed theses. According to Mandel, Soviet society is characterized as, quote, a socio-economic formation which, along with some general characteristics of societies in transition from capitalism to socialism, also combines some other specific characteristics that make it appear a still immature model of such transitional societies. End quote. Ernest Mandel, Ernest Mandel. On some points, however, without openly admitting it, Mandel was forced to revise Trotskyist doctrine. Thus, Mandel has spoken of neo-capitalism and of a third industrial revolution, notions conflicting with Trotsky's theses on the irreversibility of capitalism's phase of agony. Yet, the thesis concerning the social structure of the USSR remains essentially unchanged. The entire experience of worker states is still seen as a result of a long historical chain of unresolved contradictions between A, a planned mode of production and bourgeois norms of distribution, B, bureaucratic degeneration and planning rationalization, parenthesis, linked to rising particular interest in private consumption, end parenthesis, C, collectivist planning and hierarchical subordination of factory labor, D, between the social character of plant labor and the diversified profitability of individual firms. While for Mandel, one of the fundamental features distinguishing transitional societies is that their means of production are not commodities. For the rival Lambertist group, the real difference is that the working class, while selling its labor power for wages, does not produce surplus value because the proportion of value the working class creates does not receive and pay is a social surplus product, necessary for social consumption and for expanded reproduction. Quote, thus, the end of production is not surplus value, but expanded social consumption. End quote. It follows that for Mandel, planning has actually broken the laws of value, parenthesis, while even Stalin claimed that such laws existed in the Soviet economy in coexistence with socialism, end parenthesis. The Lambertists, on the other hand, believe that, by itself, generalized planning does not suppress the law of value. Although they add that surplus value is no longer the motor of production as long as it is no longer expropriated by single capitalists. For Mandel, the means of production lie outside the circuit of mercantile economy, since they are state-owned. For Lambertists, who consider the Soviet economy totally mercantile, state ownership of the means of production implies the final suppression of the separation of the means of production and producers, and once again, this leads them to deduce the absence of surplus value. For an extensive documentation but a heavily biased view, owing to inter-Lambertist factionalism, see Trotskyism versus Revisionism, a documentary history by C. Slater. And W. Reisner, Documents of the Fourth International, The Formative Years. End footnote. Much more could be said, but the forms taken by the dissolution of Trotskyism are already sufficiently clear. The Soviet enigma and the historical emergence of the bureaucracy as a dominant stratum have led to a lot of interpretations. Trotsky tried to consolidate the whole into a solution that would not obliterate the effects of 1917, but he had also indicated that if World War II, just beginning at the time, did not result in revolution, it would be necessary to change course, review the theory of leadership inside the workers' movement, and take into consideration the daring and disquieting pronouncements of the theorists of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. Trotsky's successors, the, quote, sons of the prophet, end quote, froze the master's doctrine and arrested theoretical research in exhausting intellectual acrobatics in order to conserve an interpretive system that Trotsky himself would have rejected in view of later world conflicts. Among Trotsky's followers, only Socialisme ou Barbarie had the courage to introduce drastically and radical... Among Trotsky's followers, only Socialisme ou Barbarie had the courage to introduce drastically critical and radical points and to revise the whole framework. The question of the bureaucracy was thus treated quite systematically and provided with original theoretical solutions that finally challenged significant aspects of the Marxist doctrinal framework. But the story of Socialisme ou Barbarie deserves an altogether separate treatment. Okay, that's the end. Thanks for listening.